Well, as I indicated in the discussion prior to this motion going to committee, I think there's something kind of Orwellian about the government's claims that involving ourselves in an arrangement with NATO, that is somehow that can stand as being not impacting, as you claim, in any way on our neutrality. And indeed, just the phrase NATO Partnership for Peace stroke NATO is kind of Orwellian. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization is a military alliance dominated by some of the most aggressive military and imperial powers in the world. It shouldn't exist as an organisation, to my mind. You could claim a rationale for NATO during the Cold War. I wouldn't, because I thought both sides in the Cold War were just aggressive imperial blocs competing for influence around the world with devastating consequences in huge numbers of places. South America, Vietnam, Africa, the Middle East, you can go through the list of the consequences of that geopolitical competition between NATO and the Soviet bloc. But whatever claimed rationale NATO might have had before the end of the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet bloc, it has absolutely no justification now. None. It shouldn't exist. And yet it exists, because the imperial ambitions of the big powers continue. The United States, Britain, France, and so on. And now Europe is progressively aligning itself with these imperial ambitions and with this expansionist and interventionist military machine. And, you know, just some recent examples of what they've done. We had the NATO chief lauding the bombing in Syria, lauding it, commending how wonderful it was that they were bombing the hell out of Syria, complimenting themselves on the NATO operation in Libya. Incredible, absolutely incredible that they could compliment themselves on that. I mean, if ever there was a disaster, it was the NATO military intervention in Libya. It has virtually destroyed the country. And we now have a situation where desperate people fleeing from parts of North Africa are being herded like slaves, abused, exploited and so on by militias operating in the mess that NATO left in Libya, and we're cooperating with them to try and prevent them crossing the Mediterranean, fleeing in desperation for a better life here. This is the sort of mess NATO created, and you want us to align with that, and you're going to drag Ireland into Europe's moves to align itself with that alliance, and then you claim that somehow this doesn't infringe on our neutrality. It's preposterous. It's ridiculous to even claim it. And it's equally ridiculous for you to suggest that the immunities and so on, that this status of forces agreement with NATO Partnership for Peace, well, it's not going to operate here, so our neutrality won't be infringed on. Give us a break, will you? 2 million US troops have gone through Shannon Airport to prosecute a war in Iraq that absolutely destroyed Iraq. And we participated in that by allowing those troops through Shannon, and the consequences for Iraq, I mean, and for the whole region, have been an absolute disaster. Just as those of us who mobilised in the protest back in 2003 warned they would be disastrous for Iraq. But indeed, even our most, even our sort of worst case estimates of what that war would cost for Iraq were dwarfed by the murderous reality of that war. I remember at the time writing an article in the Irish Times prior to the war saying that groups had been estimating that up to 50,000 people would die in Iraq as a result of it if the war went ahead. Credible estimates now put the death toll in Iraq as a result of that war at in excess of 1 million people. The greatest refugee crisis in the modern history of the world resulted from that. About 4 million people displaced as a result of that war. Iraqi society just absolutely devastated. It will probably never recover. Depleted uranium munitions all over Iraq, poisoning and deforming children not even born, and will be doing so for generations into the future. Munitions used by these very powers that you want to align us with, and the mess that is in Syria today would not have happened if it wasn't for that military intervention in Iraq. It's a direct consequence, the growth of ISIS, everything, a direct consequence of the Iraq war. And you want us to align with these people, and you claim it doesn't infringe on our neutrality. It's just absolutely dishonest nonsense. And if, you know, if the evidence of what NATO have done, what the powers who are central to NATO have done, and there are many more examples one could give, I haven't got time, is not enough in and of itself, what are the European promoters of European militarisation saying about their project? They're saying, we're developing a European army. Merkel says it explicitly in the European Parliament in the last few weeks. We're developing a European army. Macron says we're developing a European army. Tusk says we're developing a European army. Mogherini says we're developing a European army. In fact, every major promoter of the common defence and security policy, of the stuff that was inserted into the various treaties to institutionalise this evolving European military structure, every single one of them have said it's about developing a European army. And yet the minister comes in here and says, no impact on our neutrality, not at all, everything's fine. I mean, it's ridiculous. You know it's ridiculous, and everybody knows it's ridiculous. And any opinion polls that have been done on it show the population thinks it's ridiculous, because they believed it was wrong for us to facilitate US troops in the Iraq war, and they believe in their majority that these sort of things are infringing on our neutrality. And you resist properly defining neutrality because the fact that it isn't properly defined allows you to claim this sort of ridiculous Orwellian suggestion that we're not eroding, destroying our neutrality. But any meaningful definition, I mean, the Hague Convention's definition of neutrality, when applied to what we did in Shannon, would clearly put us outside any meaningful definition of neutrality, because we would be allowing forces engaged in conducting a war, aggressive military action, to use our territory to do that, providing, if you like, logistical support for that. That is breaching neutrality. But it's only because you won't actually define it, you resist defining it, that it's not clearly set out in the Constitution or in law, therefore you can make these ridiculous claims. So, you know, it's not going to make any difference, and I know the Minister's going to get up and just repeat again and again that this isn't impacting on our neutrality, and Fianna Fáil will do the same, because, let's tell the truth. What's the dirty secret of all of this? We're afraid to say boo to the Americans. That's the truth. Everybody knows it's the truth. We wouldn't dare suggest to the Americans that they should remove their troops from Shannon, or indeed in any way question their right to act as the global policeman. That's the reality. At least it would be honest if you just said that. That's the real reason that we're shredding our neutrality. And 100 years after on the 100th anniversary of the Dáil and so on, it is kind of poignant. The Irish Revolution, among other things, was a revolution against empires. That's what it was about. Fundamentally, it was against empires. And yet what you're doing is progressively dragging us into an imperial project, which is NATO. And frankly, it's quite shameful.
and